Looks like I'm doing this now. Portugal. It exists. Shocking, I know. At one point it was pretty big, but then a couple bad decisions later, and now not so much. For this scenario, we start off in medieval Europe, 1211. In our timeline, Alfonso II of Portugal married Eurica of Castile, which strengthened ties between Castile and Portugal, but didn't lead to unification between the two kingdoms. If they had children but lacked strong male heirs to the throne, unlike in our timeline, or some sort of dynastic crisis happened, then Alfonso and Eurica's descendants could have ruled both kingdoms. Next step, we will then have whatever the colony union between Portugal and Castile, unified with Aragon through marriage as well, when King Martin I of Aragon died without any heirs in 1410. Portugal could have helped them out doing this by marrying into the Aragonese royal family at an earlier date, which would then make unification possible. Next up, we could then have another union between Portugal and Navarre in 1425, after the death of Charles III of Navarre. There were disputes over who would succeed him, so if Portugal could do another marriage in this timeline beforehand, then they could also unite with Navarre. By the way, I'm starting to notice a common theme of marrying off a bunch of royals, but I guess that's what royal children are meant to do. For this last country, the Iberian Peninsula, we have Granada, who was the last remaining Muslim kingdom in Iberia, who will become a target because of the Reconquista, which is a series of wars that kicked the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula. What we will do is have whatever the hell Portugal is called now to invade Granada by blockading its coast and then invading them after the weekend. After that, they will then absolutely desolate Granada, and then in the peace treaty, they will fully annex them. After this, Portugal would then start to convert the Muslims to Catholicism and kill/deport the rest who resist. They will also start to build up industry and logistics in the Granada region, which will then be used to revive the crusades and launch an attack on North Africa. Before we talk about the revival of the crusades, we first have to discuss the colonization of the Americas. Portugal will most likely discover the Americas around the same time as Spain did in our timeline. In our timeline, the Americas was split between Spain and Portugal by the Pope, but in this timeline, since Spain won't exist, Portugal will not have much competition because Britain didn't establish its first successful colony until a century later, and France not for another 30 years. What we will instead do is have Portugal focus more on colonizing the west coast of North America instead of establishing a series of ports in multiple locations throughout North America, while also conquering the Aztecs and Incas like in our timeline to get rich off of their gold, which will immediately help them out for the revival of the Crusades. After much buildup of the Portuguese army and navy, they will then launch the attack on the North African colonies sometime in the mid-1500s. They would do the invasion of North Africa, similarly doing what they did with Granada, by blockading the North African countries and shelling and raiding their coasts. Then, one by one, they would start to launch naval landings and take over Morocco, and then use them to pick off the rest of the North African countries off over time until eventually they either surrender or capitulate. Then in the peace treaty, they will all be puppeted, and then will go through the same process of conversion as what happened in Granada, except with a bit more slavery, so they can help out with the colonization of North America. North Africa will be resettled by people all across Portugal until it is eventually annexed into Portuguese property. Since these people will be from all over Portugal, all of the multiple cultures will start to mix, which will be the basis for the new alternate Portuguese identity. We now fast forward to the 30 Years' War, which will now be a lot more different compared to our timeline, because Portugal will be a lot bigger and much more powerful than Spain in our timeline, while also not being controlled by the Habsburgs. In the 30 Years' War, it will start with Bohemia still trying to gain independence from Austria, just like in our timeline, and the sides would be relatively the same, with France still joining the Protestants for the sake of trying to regain Portugal's regional dominance. What would be different would be the Catholics securing an alliance with Polish Lithuania. Portugal making some minor concessions to the Ottomans to keep them out of the war, which could be giving them some ports along the Mediterranean, or even some minor land concessions in North Africa, along with some trade deals in their favor with the Catholics. Britain would be the wild card of the war and could get involved on the Protestant side later in the war, which would leave the sides looking roughly like this. Now, the main ambitions for the Catholics, aside from spreading Catholicism across Europe, would be for Portugal to weaken France's power, for the Austrians to gain hegemony over the HRE to make the Confederation more centralized, and for the Poles to weaken Sweden's power, along with gaining some valuable HRE territories. For Portugal to take down France, what we would first have to do is weaken them while also distracting them from the Austrian front by conquering New France, the Dutch colony, and later in the war, the British colony. Back in Europe, Portugal would also block the French off from the access to the Mediterranean, so they can fight out the rest of the French navy that's stationed in the Mediterranean. While the naval war was going on, the Portuguese would be secretly sending a lot of their troops to the Austrian front. On the Austrian front, the Austrians would have taken a completely defensive stance against France by creating a defensive line to prevent France through breaking through Belgium at the expense of the other HRE states under Austrian rule. While the Austrians are holding down the defensive line, they will go and capitulate the Netherlands, which will be a big blow to the Protestants, while the Austrians are focusing most of the manpower on the defensive line that they have created. The Polish-Lithuanians would play an important role in keeping the Protestant Germanic states at bay by conquering them with some help from the Austrians so that the Austrians can focus most of the resources on the defensive line. Fast forwarding a few years into the future, and the Portuguese would have defeated most of the French navy in the Mediterranean, and are now starting to do naval landings in the south, along with their land invasion, which would divert significant French resources from the Polish-Austrian front in the north. Then, with all the Portuguese troops that would have been moved to the defensive line over time, they would then surprise the French and break the defensive line, eventually capturing Paris, which is something that Spain almost did in our timeline. Then, after the French being completely cut off from the Mediterranean, they will have no choice but to surrender. By now, if Sweden, Denmark, or Norway, England, and also technically Scotland joined the war, they would most likely leave the war after France's surrender. In the peace treaty, France and England will surrender their overseas North American colonies to Portugal. On top of that, France will also give up some of its southern territories, and Portugal will install a puppet monarch in France. Next, the Austrians will gain territories in northern France, as well as cementing their hegemony over the HRE to create a more centralized model, which the Netherlands would rejoin. The Austrians would then annex some Protestant HRE countries, creating this monstrosity of border gore. So to compensate, we will get the Austrians to give these two exclaves to France, which will make the border gore slightly less gory. The Scandinavian countries and England didn't really participate too much in this war, so they will be forced to pay minor war reparations with no territorial concessions. The last country we'll be covering is Poland, who will gain some of the northern HRE territories. And that's it. As you can see, a lot has changed before and after the 30 Years' War, which probably didn't last 30 years in this timeline, but oh well. For the rest of the 1600s, Portugal would be focusing on putting down rebellions in France that aren't happy about the puppet monarch being installed, along with also gaining influence over Scotland by helping Scottish factions who didn't support the Union of the Crowns agreement, which led to Scotland and England eventually unifying in our timeline, by helping them gain power and influence in Scotland. How they could then abolish the agreement is by taking advantage of England's political instability, because by 1642, the English Civil War had started. During the English Civil War, Portugal can strategically influence the Civil War to make it deadlier and last longer than our timeline, through playing off all sides of the Civil War by providing some economical and military support to both the parliamentarians and the royalists, to weaken England even more over time. During the Civil War, Scotland could also invade northern England, which is culturally similar to Scotland, and then after the Civil War is over, they could then annex northern England, as well as abolishing the Union of the Crowns agreement, cementing their independence from England, and alliance with Portugal. This would then leave Portugal as a dominant European power, through having severely weakened England and a more powerful Scotland. After the Civil War, Scotland could then further exploit England's weakness by conquering the island states with Portuguese support, which would then cement Scotland's dominance over the British Isles. During all of those events, Portugal will be further getting richer through further colonizing the Americas, which will have full hegemony over now that England and France have been kicked out, and they will continue to wage wars and conquer indigenous tribes to gain their land and resources, which will continue to make Portugal significantly more rich and powerful than all the other countries in the world. Back to Europe, towards the end of the war in the 1600s, after France's resistance has mostly subsided, Portugal could then conquer the Papal states to gain control over the papacy, along with the rest of the Italian peninsula, so that they could have even more dominance over the Mediterranean, which could also be used to counteract the Ottomans, who would become increasingly hostile towards all of the other European countries over the century. Lastly, the main effect from the alternate 30 Years' War would be the Habsburgs gaining full dominance over the HRE, which they would then slowly start to centralize over time, and would be on track to achieve full federalization about a century after the alternate 30 Years' War. Next, we need to discuss the Ottomans. Now, if you know anything about the Ottomans, then you would know that they're annoying as hell and are always causing border clashes and stuff like that. So long story short, by the end of the 17th century, their decline will start, and the great powers would take advantage of that. And the last thing we're going to cover is this. Boom. And now that is going to lead into the Great Northern War. So Sweden's been pulling an Ottoman Empire and ticking off a bunch of countries because Poland claims some lost territory in the Balkans. Russia wants access to the Baltic Sea, and Denmark, Norway wants their land back. So long story short, Sweden gets their butt kicked, and in the peace treaty, full partition. Sorry, Swedes. From here on out, the Ottomans will continue to decline and be partitioned further by Portugal, and unfortunately for the Polish fans out there, Poland will also be partitioned just like in our timeline. This is because, in our timeline, they had a political system that was even more corrupt than the EU, and I guess pretty much every other country in the world at this point. Anyways, because of all the political instability they had in our timeline, I have no reason to suspect that it would be any different than in this timeline. There would also be a lot of ethnic minorities in Poland from the previous wars that they have participated in this timeline that would most likely want to take advantage of this situation to break away from Poland, which will lead to a full-on civil war most likely. After the Poles get their stuff together, they would then be reduced to nothing but a buffer state between the Austrians and Russia, because they would have taken advantage of the situation to expand their borders. By now, we are in the late 1800s, and Portugal in this timeline would start the Industrial Revolution instead of Great Britain. Unlike in our timeline, the Industrial Revolution would spread much more quickly to other countries in our timeline, who would then begin industrializing shortly after Portugal starts to, which would eventually lead to the scramble for Africa like in our timeline. Before we talk about that, I wanted to give you a quick update on Portugal's colonies in North America, and as you can see, they have long since been colonized. Now over to Africa. Because of the Industrial Revolution, the European great powers would want to carve up Africa again to gain their natural resources. The scramble for Africa would be completely different in this timeline, but what I can say for certain is that Portugal would want all of the Sahara to protect their territories in northern Africa, as well as the territories surrounding the Nile River for trade purposes, and some of the fertile land in Central Africa, leaving the borders looking like Greg Hafley's head in Diving Whippy Kid if you just have one hair. Next is England. Now in this timeline, it's impossible to tell if England is still a great power or not, because they could have just given up after Portugal bolstered Scotland's power, surrounding them militarily as a result. So to make my life easier, we're just going to say at some point before the scramble for Africa, England and Scotland unite, because I said so. Now back to the scramble for Africa, and we will give them all of this land, and as you can tell from the lack of straight lines, Scotland is way more dominant in the UK than in our timeline, so they instead chose to make their colonies appear like inverted diamonds, or rhombuses for all you nerds out there, instead of straight lines. Yay equality. Except for all the innocent African men women, and children who are going to get conquered after the treaty's done and lose their homes and most likely each other when they get caught in the fog of war. That got pretty dark. Next up, we have Denmark-Norway, or Denmark-Norway-Sweden, or the Nordic Union, or whatever the hell they're called. I'll just call them the Kalmar Union for the sake of it. I will give them all this useless desert land down in South Africa, which is an accurate representation of how useless all the nicknames we have created for that hypothetical union are. Next up, we have Austria, or the HRE, or Greater Germany, or whatever the hell you want to call them. At this point, I'm sick of all the nicknames that we've given all these countries. I'm starting to notice a common theme. We'll give whatever the hell this country's called some more valuable territories in Central Africa, where they will then proceed to make a colony that looks like a K. It's crazy the kinds of borders we were able to achieve without Britain. Last of all, we have Poland, who would be the Belgium of the scenario, since they are now reduced to a neutral buffer state. They will get the Central African territory in exchange for allowing all the other great powers to extract resources from it. Since this is exactly like the Congo in our timeline, we will have the Polish take out their anger of losing all of their land to the Austrians and Russia by using the local Africans available as punching bags if you're picking up what I'm putting down. Again, that got pretty dark. Moving on to Asia, and it would be completely unrecognizable compared to our timeline. Now, I don't think that Portugal would be too interested in colonizing parts of Asia, so I have a feeling that would most likely be the Austrians taking their place. As we can see, without Big Daddy America being around, nothing is going to stop China from being partitioned just a little bit. Iran and Afghanistan will remain as buffer states between Portugal and Russia. The UK will colonize parts of India and Pakistan, and Portugal will get the rest, as historically they did have some influence over Sri Lanka. The UK will also have influence over Tibet, Nepal, and Bhutan. Russia will gain all of the Mongolian territory, Xinjiang, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and Taiwan, and Austria will gain control over all the rest, except for the remains of China. Moving on to Oceania, and as you can see, it's all Austrian now. Back in Europe, there isn't too much left to do. However, an interesting thing that could potentially happen throughout the 1900s is the unionizing of all of Portugal and its puppets because Roman Empire. But in all seriousness, by now, a decent amount of the coastal regions would have been colonized by the Portuguese, and the rest would want to join because Roman Empire. Also, by this point, the Austrians probably colonized all of their puppet states, so boom, now they're bigger too. And the last thing we will cover is Portugal giving rights to all their colonies by slowly integrating them into the political system over the course of the 18 and 1900s to establish an Imperial federation. So with that, I would say we're pretty much done. And as you can see, I think we did a pretty good job of making everything go perfect for Portugal. But that's just my own humble opinion, and I could be completely wrong, and I could have made them much bigger, conquering the entire world. But in all seriousness, my lord, I think I did a pretty amazing job. United Kingdom plays. I hope you're happy, and thank you for the suggestion for this scenario. I hope you enjoyed the video, man. You're not kidding about needing a lot of time to work on it. I made about 70 maps, granted some were much harder to make than others, and there's also a hell of a lot of research I had to do that went into this. So for the next little while, I'm probably not going to do anything as complicated as this video. Overall, some spots could have played out in different ways with similar results, but overall, I say it was pretty realistic, but at least I hope it was. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video, everyone. Don't get anyone pregnant, but if you do, make sure they're hot, and I'll see you all in the next video, which will be a little bit different from the others, so stay tuned.